Hi everybody. Sorry for the late start. Had a little issue with my live button, but anyway, we got it working, so welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elke Feuer. I'm an author and a fiction book coach, and I am an author on my own journey, helping as many writers along the way as I can. So tonight, the topic for today is going to be how to self-edit your book. Now, before you even possibly think about editing, one of the things that you want to consider is if your book is actually ready. So I recommend going and watching a video that I did on how to know if your book is ready, and that will give you some tips to know if you're ready to go to this stage that I'm going to be talking about, which is how to edit your book. One of the things I've talked about editing before, but what I'm going to do in this video is really dive deep into my four phases of editing, step by step through my checklist. Because a lot of times some of the comments have sort of been, well, what does that actually look like? I've kind of paraphrased or just said, this is what's covered. And then I kind of say, go check out the checklist, and that'll kind of give you a little bit more detail. But what I'm actually going to do tonight is dive into the four phases of the self-editing. Now, it's also going to include beta readers and professional editors as well too. So just to keep that in mind as well. So let's dive in. For phase one, what I look at is, the first thing I do is I set the story aside, and that's usually 2 weeks to a month. I usually don't like to wait as long as a month unless I'm really not happy with the story or there's something going crazy with my schedule. So I like to set the book aside so that when I come back to it, I'm looking at it with fresh eyes. Because sometimes if we dive right back in right to the beginning, it's almost like we're still in editing mode and not sort of looking at it as a reader or with fresh eyes. So that's the first thing that I do. The next thing I do is I like to reread the story. And I go through each chapter and make any changes, changes that I notice as I'm going. And this can be to the prose, to the characters, descriptions, anything that I see that needs to be changed, chapter by chapter, very slowly, very carefully. Then I go in and I dive in. And then of course I kill off all my darlings, which is any story elements that really don't work. And and also I look at scenes that don't serve a purpose. If, we might love that scene and we might think it's great, but if it's really not working, then it's like, I'm like, as much as I hate it, I cut it. If I really love it and I think I might be able to make it work, then I save it to another document separate, is what I usually do as well. I also make any notes of any plot issues that maybe I can't make in that edit, or that are going to require a lot of changes. Then I make notes of those if there are major plot holes, I make a note of those to go back in another phase to fix those. I know some writers that like to do it at that stage. It just depends on the way that you edit. Everybody has their own way that they edit, and this is just the way that works for me. I look at the pacing of the story as I'm going and analyzing each chapter. Is each chapter moving along smoothly? Or is it sort of lagging here and there? And I make a note of that as well, so that it's something that I'm aware of as I'm working through the story. If there's a way that I can fix that so that the pacing is better. Then the next thing that I look at in phase one is the character arc. And basically this is my main character's journey. I focus on my main character first, or my hero. The hero and the heroine, the two main characters in the story, to make sure that their journey from when they started to where they need to be, it flows and it makes sense, and that there's not additional changes or things that need to happen in their journey before they get to the end of the book. I go ahead and I make all of those changes. So like the plot holes that I made a note of, I was thinking I did that in another phase, but that's another bit of editing. So I make all of the changes that the chapter by chapter, any plot issues that I can make, plot issues that I can resolve, I go through and make those at that stage. And then also with the pacing of the story, I go through and I do that as one edit. So that's sort of like my first phase of my editing. As far as time frame, I like to give myself a month through the whole process. But as I said, it's just a matter of every writer's different. Like right now, I've got 4 days to finish editing a book before I send it to my editors. So that's crunch time for me. But then I've been working on it for probably about a month. So it's been technically a little bit longer than a month, but anyway, that's a whole other story. So now we're gonna dive into phase 2 and what I do in the second phase of edits. Now, depending on how drastic my changes are, I keep the same, I'm in the same document, but if I'm going to the next phase, then I tend to do editing. I'll be like version 2 of the story. I know some writers have a lot of versions. I usually don't end up with more than 3 or 4, just because I end up changing my mind about some certain things, and it ends up creating more havoc for me. So I find that, okay, unless it's something that I really love, then I'll save it in another document and then decide, do I still want it? Does it still work? If not, I don't have like 10 different versions of the story. That just doesn't work for me. Every writer is different. Like I said, you have to find what works for you. So this is usually version 2, maybe 3, depending on if there were any major plot issues when I'm going into phase 2 of editing. So the first thing at this stage, I actually like to print out my book, which I know that's not always easy and not always possible, but it's something that, like I said, I find that it's another way of editing the book, because I find you pick up a lot more mistakes and issues when you're looking at a physical printed version versus online. If money is an issue, because I know you're paying by the page, I highly recommend double-sided page, and then take out that extra spacing and just give yourself shorter, more margins on the side for you to make notes. That's what I do. Okay, so I print out the manuscript with a large margin. And as I said, double-sided. I'm all about double-sided. Let's save as many trees as we can, y'all. So then I read through the manual out loud is what I do. As much as possible. If I'm in a public place, obviously that's not gonna work out as great, but I try to read it out loud as well too, because a lot of times when you read something out loud, you pick up a lot more issues and mistakes, and you can also hear how it sounds when you're reading the story as well too. So it helps with dialogue, with flow, with the way a sentence, does it make sense? Because in your head, sometimes what we see versus what we say out loud is completely different. So that's one thing that I find really helps me in the editing process. And then I write down anything that I see that needs to be changed or highlighted or circle, whatever works for you. I tend to make notes on the side of any issues that I need to change, or I'll circle something that isn't working and then make the note. So I use different ways. I know some writers that use shorthand, totally not me, don't know shorthand, but they're editors themselves, and so they have their own little key, I guess you could say, to when they're editing for themselves. And as I said, I write those down in the margin on the side so that it's right by where it needs to be fixed. Okay, and then once I do that, once I've gone through the entire book, then I take the printed version and I sit down and I carefully go through chapter by chapter what all the changes that need to be done, and I make those changes at that time. I have a note here to myself: if you cannot print out your manuscript, then I recommend reading out loud and making changes on the screen as you go, or writing them down, saying chapter 3, page, whatever, like I said, It's about finding what works for you. There is no right or wrong way in the editing process. I'm not saying in how you're editing, but maybe the process itself. That makes sense. That is phase 2, okay? By this time, I've mostly worked out like all the plot issues, things like that. And then just a little tip, something that I do, if I'm really struggling with the flow of the story, the chapters, or something's not working for me, it's usually somewhere in the middle, trying to tie from the beginning, the crap that happens in the middle, and then trying to tie that to the end so that it all works together really well. Especially when you're writing mystery. For me, it can be a challenge sometimes. Some books are easy, some not so much. 2 things that I like to do is I do a timeline, because it visually helps me to see the whole book. So I basically say scene or chapter 1, what happens, the major things that happen. And then I sort of do that, and I just, like I said, create a timeline for the whole book with all the chapters, so that it helps me to visually see how the story happens and unfolds. Now, if that's not working and it's a real crap show, then one of the things that I'll do is I'll actually create a spreadsheet, or not create, I have a spreadsheet. I'll use a spreadsheet that basically tracks the chapter, what's happening in the scene. I think if there's like who the victim was, what's the major thing that's happening in the story? Is it a romance scene? Is it a mystery scene? You know, all those different things. It's a lot more detailed. That really helps me to pinpoint what's not working and where the issues are with either the story, the romance, or maybe just the mystery, maybe something with the timeline, something's not working. That really helps me. Now, this takes a lot of time. This usually takes me a week or 2 to fill in that spreadsheet, because like I said, it's really detailed, but it's totally worth it for me to really help me work through the issues that I have. And speaking of the middle of the book, if you struggle in the middle of the book like I do, I have a video, which I'll share the link for that is actually how to get through the messy middle. So I'll share that in the link as well for you, so that you can check that out for yourself. Now, that's an older video, so I apologize for the bad lighting and anything else that's going on in there. So, all right, so on to phase 3. Okay, so by this phase, all the major story issues are done and resolved. And what I'm actually looking at is more sort of the first thing. Let me just dive into each thing before I start paraphrasing, is the characters. I start with the characters first. And what I'm looking for is their voices are consistent, because I have a tendency that most of my characters, unless they're distinctly different, tend to sound the same way. And I don't always pick it up until I'm doing this phase. And another thing is, in my first book, I had characters who had different accents. They were from different places. So I had to make sure that those were consistent throughout the book. So these are some of the things that I look for. If they have any quirks in how they talk, mannerisms, things like that, then their physical and emotional descriptions, all of those things match the character throughout the whole entire book. And how I do that is I like to go through and highlight all the scenes with that character and sort of read it through, so that I'm reading them throughout the whole book. That's kind of how I do it. The next thing that I look at is dialogue. Is their dialogue revealing their character, who they are as a person? Is it more so that my characters aren't sort of 3-dimensional, they're a little bit more real? So I like to do that and making sure that their dialogue actually also reveals their goals, their motivations, that it fits the character so that they don't sound the same, as I said earlier, and to make sure that it has action and not just all said, because sometimes I as I'm writing through the scene quickly, I forget to say, okay, am I moving them through the scene as they're talking? Am I describing what they're doing? So if I like to double check that to make sure that I'm doing that throughout the book and that it's not just all dialogue or within the scene. that it's not all dialogue and nothing else. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but for me, it's like, I find it makes it more, more rounded if there's movement in there along with the dialogue with it, especially if it needs it within the scene or within the chapters. Okay, so that's one of the things that I like to check when I'm looking at dialogue. Oh, I forgot to mention there, internal as well as external dialogue, because sometimes we do one or the one, more of one or the other, and basically not having a nice balance of both of those. So that's another thing that I look at as well too. The next thing that I look at are the sentences. And this is kind of where I'm paying a little bit more attention, so that I'm looking that the sentence is showing and not telling, where needed, obviously, that I'm using active instead of passive wording, that I'm removing any filler words. I usually do a search. I have like a handful of filler words that I have a tendency to go towards that my editor sent me. So I tend to do a search for those and see if I can just quickly remove those as well too. And that I'm also using stronger verbs instead of, so that it's kind of tied in with what I was saying about active versus passive, and just making sure that the way that the sentences that I'm using are the best that they can be. So that's that, especially if I feel like, because sometimes you're like, yeah, this is great, and then sometimes like, I'm not feeling this sentence, or I'm not feeling these sentences, it just doesn't fit the rest of the scene. Then that's when I say, okay, how can I fix this? How can I make it better? Okay, and then the next thing that I look at are my settings. And what I like to do is, and I use, in my checklist, it says use 5 senses, but to be honest, this year I just started using 6th sense, which I don't know if it's technically considered a 6th sense, but it's more of what is it that they're sensing or feeling? What's the emotion behind it? Because usually I tend to focus and make sure that those 5 senses are being used, but I'm also adding to say, okay, how are they feeling in the moment? What's the emotion in the setting, as far as how does the setting feel? Because some settings have a feeling. You can describe them and you can get a feel of that feeling, but for me it's like, okay, how can I really draw the reader in even more? So that's one of the 6 senses that I've added when I'm looking at my descriptions and how I can make them better. And the other thing is that the adjectives are used in a minimum because it's easy to use adjectives to describe something rather than focusing on really finding a clearer way of describing the setting of where the character is at that moment. Okay? And the next thing that I look at in this phase is the scenes and the chapters. And what that looks like is just how the transitions are. Are the transitions smooth from one chapter to the next, or from one scene to the next? Is it clear, or is it just sort of very choppy? Is it flowing really easily as far as from scene to scene and from chapter to chapter? The other thing I look at is if I have hooks and cliffhangers, are they strong, or do I need to add a cliffhanger or a hook, whether it's at the beginning of the chapter or at the end of the chapter, or even maybe in the scenes? It's just looking at to say, are the chapters, the beginning and the end, strong enough that I feel like, I want to keep reading, because that's really what you want to make sure that they're strong. Your scenes and your chapters are strong so that you're drawing the reader along. So that's kind of with pacing, but just diving a little bit more into the transitions and the hooks and cliffhangers, so that they're make sense, as I said, and that also that they're impactful. That's not just impactful, I like to say emotionally impactful, because that's really when you are able to hold, not just pull the reader in, but to hold them so that they do want to continue reading. Because sometimes if you take them on this emotional roller coaster, it's almost like, oh. And then if there's big lulls in between, then you can tend to lose them. So you want to make sure that you're keeping that consistent as much as possible. All right, so on to the last phase. Okay, so this phase is basically, I should say phase 3 is really where I've wrapped up and done everything that I can. I don't do a lot of proofreading myself just because that is not a strength of mine. I'm just being honest. I usually leave that to my beta readers, my editors, things like that. I'm focusing on sort of the more bigger things in the story. Not that proofreading isn't important, but by the 3rd phase, I'm happy with the story. Everything's good. I'm ready to send it to an editor. Or as I say in phase 4, I'm sending it, the first thing I'm doing before I send it to my editors are my beta readers. And if you want to know a little bit more about beta readers, what they are, how they can benefit you, I have another video that I'll share in the links of where you can watch more about that as well too. If you haven't used beta readers, they're just a really great tool to have as a writer. So after I'm happy with the story, everything that I wanted to fix is on my checklist, and then I send it to my beta readers. So you can use beta readers for up to 2 rounds. It really just depends on, like, if you're really not sure, you're stuck, the story isn't happening, and you just want to send it to them to kind of get their feedback and get more input from them so that you can work through those difficulties. I've done that before as well too, and I know a lot of writers who do. So that is an option, but I'm at the stage where I'm trying not to do that because it tends to draw out when my books get published, and it's been so long already, so that's a whole other story. But anyway, so what I like to do, let me take a step back. With beta readers, what you're looking at is, as far as who they are, where to find them, you can start with friends and family. That's what I did. But let me caution you, you're looking for friends and family who are going to give you tangible feedback and honest feedback. You don't want friends and family who are just going to say, oh, it's great, it's wonderful, and they're just stroking your ego. You really want friends and family, and let's face it, we all have them, who are going to be brutally honest, right? And tell you what they think, because that's really what you want. All right, the other thing is that there can be what I call professional beta readers, where this is what they do, they love doing it, and they know how it works. Boom, bam, they'll give you the right feedback that you're looking for, and they're professional at it. The other ones that you can look at are just other writers. There's a lot of writers who will exchange books. I don't do this because I'm such a slow reader that I have so many friends who are authors. I would never be, I can't even get through my to-do list, my own to-be-read list, much less adding that on there. So as much as I would love to offer that, that's just not an option for me. But I know a lot of writers who are fast readers, and they do that all the time with maybe just a small circle of reader friends. The other thing is readers and fans from your email. If you have that already as an option. That's how I got some of my beta readers, were people who were fans that just loved my book, and they're just like, give it to me ahead of time. Yes, please. So that is an option as well too. So I do mention a couple other options in the video. So if you do want to look at beta readers, make sure you check that out. The next thing we're looking at is going to a professional editor. Now, before you start looking for a professional editor, I really highly recommend making sure that it's someone that you're comfortable with and that you trust. Now, that doesn't always happen with necessarily the first book. It might take a few tries with different editors before you get there. I was very blessed. I lucked out on the first editor that I got, or the first 2 editors that I got for my self-publishing books. I actually was fortunate. I don't remember the second one. I think she came recommended by somebody else, and I tried her and I just thought she was awesome. But the other one, she was someone that I met in a Facebook group, or sorry, not a Facebook group, LinkedIn group, and we just chatted and we just connected, and she just got me. I just love that she, I tend to write in fragmented sentences. I have a kind of different, my own writing style, and she tends to work with me on that so that I'm keeping my style, but I'm also growing as a writer. So she does an amazing job of that. So I really lucked out. And the other lady, she's fantastic. Like, she gives me so much resources, and she's technically proofreading, but she gives me, like, she was the one who recommended character sheets. She sent me character sheets, and I thought, oh, this is brilliant, because I kept getting like things about my character descriptions mixed up because I wasn't focused on that. I was more focused on the characters, who they were, more so than their descriptions as far as eye color, those kind of things. And I started using her style sheets, and it's made me a better writer. So like I said, I am completely blessed with my editors, but that's why it's really important that you find the right editors and ones that would fit with you. And you also want to make sure that you can trust them, that you're having a good turnaround, or a normal turnaround. I know some writers whose editors had their books for months and months and months. So you have to take that into consideration as well too. So I highly recommend that you get somebody who's recommended by another author who's already used them and can recommend them, rather than just finding some random person. Okay? When you're going to professional editor, I recommend doing 2 rounds of professional editing. 3 would be better, but minimum 2, unless you have got like amazing beta readers. And the first round of editing is usually what you call copy editing, which this looks at improving your accuracy, readability. It also to ensure that it's like free of errors, omissions, inconsistencies, repetitions within the story, the characters, things like that. My editor, she also provides me things like with the flow of the story. She gives me feedback on that, just to kind of let me know where she felt the story started to lag or it just wasn't working. So that's the first round of editing, is what they call copy editing. The next one is proofreading. And what this focuses on is the surface areas like misspellings and mistakes in grammar, punctuation, things like that. It depends on the proofreader. Like I said, my proofreader, she goes above and beyond, which is amazing. So she always gives me, if she sees stuff, then she gives me information on that, which is fantastic. So that is my 4 phases of editing right there. As far as the time frame that it takes, like I said, normally I like to edit within a month, maybe 2 months, depending on if the story is good or really crappy. And then I like to give my beta readers 2 weeks to a month, and then editors take anywhere from 2 weeks to a month. So all these things are good to know so that you can build it in, because a lot of times we think, oh, I'm going to put my book out at this stage. But if you don't work back to say how much time it's going to take to do each one of these phases, then it can extend your launch date. So these are things that are good to know as far as your editing process, how long it takes you, and how long your editors and your beta readers need in order to give you the feedback that you want, and also for you to incorporate those changes as well too. So I hope you found this information useful, and as I mentioned, I will put the link down for those other videos so that you can check them out for yourself. Thank you, and if you like the content, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.